Martin Ralph. I'm a member of the committee of the University of Liverpool University College Union. And I've just come back from the Madrid International Meeting of Militant Unions where I met Steve. And so we're proceeding with an interview.
So, Martin, why don't you talk about the political situation in Britain, the struggle here to defend the working class, the unions, some of the conflicts and the crisis in the unions, and also the development of Jeremy Corbyn, the political crisis and the situation in Britain.
Yeah. Well, I think one place to start is the situation, if you like, the political and economic situation in this country. So everyone, I think, throughout the whole world knows about Brexit and what is happening there. But what many people remark on is how contradictory now the Tory government is from one day to another, and how they make a wish list of what they want as if they were Great Britain. You know, in the past, people would talk about Great Britain as the country, but I'd never hear a worker now using the word great. They only talk about Britain. And I think that's quite significant. After all, in the past, during the Russian Revolution, they talked about the Communist Party of Great Britain. Well, they would never, no one would ever use that term today because the situation has changed so much. So I see, I think what is happening over Brexit, and I think that determines a lot of what's happening in the working class here, is they're fighting the European Union for the spoils. Who will maintain the major influence of financial transactions? At the moment, London is in some ways the center of world finance. And obviously Frankfurt, Paris, Luxembourg, all want their shares. And now I just read yesterday that the house prices in Frankfurt are going up a great deal because something like 10,000 bankers want to move to Frankfurt. So, but clearly it's not that clear. No one can say, well, this is what's going to happen, that's what's going to happen. It's very much an inter-imperialist fight, I think, that's happening. So the UK government, which I believe is really controlled by the City of London and the big financiers and so on, they want to develop trade with some of the worst regimes in the world. They go to China, they boost up, but they don't get much, they don't get a huge amount of trade coming out there. So Boris Johnson goes to the Sudan. What is the Sudan? Sudan has a genocidist government that has been, Omar al-Bashir has been accused of being a war criminal. So they will export, and they are exporting military weaponry. They increased that by 1/3 last year. So this is what they want.
And Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely, Saudi Arabia for so long has carried out the things that the US and the French and the British would like to do maybe by themselves, but they needed Saudi Arabia to do that. So this is a fight amongst capitalism. So what's happening in the working class? Well, one of the first things is, for example, the European Union says, okay, if you're going to go, you're going to have to give us 40 billion to leave. So May agrees with that. Who's going to pay that? It's certainly not going to be the bankers. You know, they're going to take it out of the public services, wages, and so on and so forth. So there is a very fierce struggle going on in this country. You might expect, considering some of the history of Britain in the past, there'd be many, many more strikes than there are at the moment. I believe the strikes are rising. I mean, obviously there's the UCU strike of 40.
And UCU, what is UCU?
Sorry, University College Union. It's in the pre-1992 universities where they have a pension scheme that is very good. Although it's been under attack, it's been pushed back a little bit. But now they want to remove direct benefits. In other words, you know what you're going to get when you retire.
A defined pension benefit.
defined pension benefits. And of course, their little ploy is to say, well, actually, we're not removing them. We're just taking them down to zero. So where's the money coming from? It will be defined contributions, which is clearly what's happening with the stock exchange, or define what you get. So the student unions throughout the country are supporting the strike, and they said one of the reasons is because the pensions could be cut by 40%. So that's why in this harsher tax you begin to get much more days of strike action. So we are taking 14 days of strike action, which is, the vote for that was the highest vote for strike action in the history of the union, and the number of days of strike is the highest we've ever tried to organise. So
this is radicalizing, these attacks are radicalizing the working class here.
Very much so, and in different ways. So I think in terms of the attack by the government, some estimates of the number of casualised workers in this country amount to about 10 million. There are many on zero-hour contracts,
It's a zero-hour contract.
Essentially, it means that you are employed by the hour. I think probably every city, hospitality industry, so-called, the restaurants and the hotels, are based on employing young workers, immigrant workers, on zero-hour contracts. So at the end of the day, they could say, thanks very much, you're finished.
So it's like a gig worker.
Yeah, it is a gig worker, absolutely. And they have very little protection. That's why there's been a number of strikes developing. In the past, people said, "Oh, you can't organise these workers. They're so, they're so casualised, etc., etc." But then, of course, the whole of the British labour movement came from those kind of conditions. So, can you organise them? Yes. Are they being organised? Yes. To some extent, well, a little bit by some of the TUC unions.
But Bakers Union and McDonald's. Why don't you talk about that? What happened to McDonald's?
Well. My nephew worked in McDonald's, or maybe 10 years ago, and the conditions that he told me that they had to put up with were appalling. So
what were those conditions?
Well, the wages were no good, but actually he didn't talk. He didn't like that, but he didn't talk so much about that. What he talked about were the safety conditions. So there would often be a case where you might be moved from one job to another, but you've got no training whatsoever. You might be employed to go on the till, and then suddenly you're in the kitchen, but you've got you might get like a day's training to do the till, but once you're inside, you didn't receive any more training, certainly at that time, and I think that is still the case. And so that meant there were burns. And there were burns from hot fat, and so they should be wearing masks. There were no masks. So one of the people leaping up to the present strike, or recent strike of McDonald's, for example, the McDonald's in Cambridge, he said, well, he complained about that, the fact that he was getting hot fat splashing on his skin. So he insisted on getting a proper mask. So they got a mask that had a crack in it. It was just a second. They just picked it up from somewhere, but it wasn't. It's like in the past, the organised trade union movement would not accept those kind of conditions at all. However, of course, we're talking about employing very young people with no tradition of organisation or trade unions, and continuing. And this is I want to move on to another point in relation to McDonald's, which is very, very important, because one of the things they all talked about, and my nephew did as well, and these talked about today when we interviewed them. They said there is constant sexual harassment. Well, of course there is, because it's privatised. And so the manager will use every means to try to push down one sector against another, and it was just rife. And if you did anything, well, it's a zero-hour contract, so goodbye. So that's why it was held down for so long, because they were inexperienced, and because of the fear of losing the job. And then in addition to that, of course, is bullying. These are the conditions that caused the strike. The wage is very, very important, but it wasn't, if you like, just the single motivating factor. It was to fight against all these things and to get some control over their lives. So that was happening. But, and one thing that I'd like to say, and not many people are talking about this today, the most militant strikes are in London. London's got, over cleaners, security guards, and so on. And they've formed, in the last few years, new unions. The two main ones, United Voices of the World and Independent Workers, GB, we support. And I think every thinking trade unionist should support as well. At the UCU Congress, I made a speech of solidarity, and we raised over £400, which is not a great deal of money, but it was something to show our solidarity with one of the strikes in London. But I think it's that type of strike and that type of organisation will continue to grow. These are not TUC unions. These are outside of that control.
So they're independent unions that have been formed by the workers themselves.
Yeah, and there's others forming as well. There's another group called Angry Workers. These kind of names that maybe we've never seen before, but we've certainly not seen for a very, very long time.
The angry workers, and there are angry workers.
Yeah. And one example is that they are helping to organise in I think it's a textile factory of Indian workers. The language is an issue, but the oppression is very great. So they're discussing their meeting on how to help these set of workers. So it's a very interesting, and there's other little groups forming. Maybe they're not big.
But it's percolating.
It's percolating, yeah. And that's very, very interesting.
So there's a bubbling up of working class organizing and movement because of the conditions in the working class.
Yeah. There's a recent video of the picket outside London University, which you don't see in this country. You see it in Brazil, or you see it in some other countries, but there's a few hundred of them. People are getting up, making speeches.
It's not controlled by the bureaucracy.
It's not controlled by the bureaucracy. There's lots of red flags, and there's a lot of music, and not just sort of lively music to go with the kind of feeling and passion that exists there. And I can let you have the URL for that video. Real News did one, and that was really interesting. But that's the type of trade unionism we have to develop in this country. Now, there is a problem. Inside the working class, there's a great and deepening anger against austerity. And I think the way forward is you have to fight austerity day in, day out, week in, week out, etc. And we have to fight all cuts. And I don't care who is making those cuts, but you've got to fight them. Now, in Liverpool, and we're in Liverpool, so some years ago, I think it was about 2014, Joe Anderson, who's now the mayor, and is still the leader of the Labour Council, said, well, the cuts we're outlining now to make will kill people. So this is now 2008. So undoubtedly, no one will deny these cuts in Liverpool and every city have killed people, and often the most vulnerable people.
People in dementia, they're being pushed out of hospitals, and they're basically killing people here in Britain.
Social care, the rise of homelessness. There's not enough spaces.
It's cold outside.
Yeah, it is at the moment, yes. So
you don't live long living outside.
No, you don't. And so what do the Labour councils do? Well, they're only here. They're professional beggars, is one line. And they shouldn't be, messing up the city centres. So we should remove them. Where? Well, that's another question, but not to decent accommodation. So there are many issues like this. The problem with the rise of Corbynism, which is a reflection of that anger against...
And talk about Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, how did he end up as the leader of the Labour Party? He was an outsider.
Yeah, I think you come back to the old question of, the crisis of leadership that exists within the working class after the fall of the Soviet Union. There was part of that process saw a right-wing move inside the Labour Party with Tony Blair. So a lot of things have been said about Tony Blair and Iraq and Afghanistan.
The capitalists bring him forward a lot in the United States as the representative of labor.
Yeah. Well, there is a problem because the Labour Party didn't overthrow him. They elected him. So he became the leader, and then he was elected in. But it was, they called it, of course, they don't say it these days, but it was the third way, which meant we'll privatise in a different way. So under Margaret Thatcher, they brought in private financial initiative. But even that deal wasn't good enough for capitalism, because I think capitalism is decaying in this country. So they need ever greater assurances that they're going to make profit and so on, that's organised through the state. So this idea of, we don't want a nanny state. Well, we don't want a state for the benefit of workers, for Thatcher, but we want a state for the benefit of capital. And we'll go to the ends of the earth to establish
So you have to make things profitable.
You've got to make things profitable all the time. So Tony Blair brought in a new form of PFI. And
PFI is?
Private Finance Initiative, which came out of the private finance partnerships and so on. And now they're beginning to fail, yet again. So capitalism cannot run public services. And that's a huge ideological problem for them.
And they privatized the railways, and now the railways are going bankrupt under private capitalists. And Carillion privatized again. And so all these companies that they were set up to supposedly make capitalism more efficient, now they're going bankrupt. For the Tories, that must be quite excruciating.
Yes, it is. And even more so that since Corbyn has become leader, the Labour Party has continued with PFIs in a huge way. So Carillion was building a hospital, or not building a hospital, in Liverpool, and of course it's frozen now. But all the Labour Party who had a voice, who were the leaders of the Labour Party in Liverpool, supported the PFI. And we had a very good activist called Sam Semoff, and he took out a case against the PFI, and he was absolutely attacked by the Labour leaders, absolutely, that he was a time waster, that he was...
What did he say in his case? What was his case about?
He said that going to the heart of the question of the PFI is, if we want to raise money to build a school or hospital or something, the cheapest way to do that is through local government, public institutions, because the market sees that, that they're much more likely to be here than private capital. So private capital can raise money, obviously, but it costs much more money. And now, in fact, all this has come out that if the PFIs continue, it will mean something like 200 billion extra will have been paid into the pockets of the private capital. And it's well worth people looking at some of the scandals. So say you got, in a hospital you have a room like this, and then you want another plug put in, a socket put in the wall. Okay, well that will be about £1,000 at least. If you want a screen put on the wall, well, the wall is owned, not now, but it was owned by like Carillion all that time. So you've got to pay them to change the whole situation of the room. And so it was absolutely scandalous. It was a way of just pouring money down the drain, and it can't last. And so these were the kind of things that Sam was saying. And in fact, he got a lot of support, so much so that not the whole hospital was PFI. He managed to force them to raise, I think, 200 million, something like this. I can't remember the exact figure. So in fact, he should be a local hero. And the Labour Party should apologise and should say, Sam Semoff was absolutely right, we should not have gone down the PFI road. But who is saying that? inside the Labour Party. Because we say, okay, there are left activists inside the Labour Party. What we'd say is, make it absolutely clear. Go to your Labour Party organisation and make it clear that, take your motion, that you're absolutely 100% opposed to PFI, and that those who fought and pushed through PFI should go. Because the right-wing Labour are in control of every single council in this country. And if you don't deal with that, you're not going to deal with capitalism. And that's a problem, because Jeremy Corbyn sent a letter saying, over a year ago, saying all councils should set legal budgets. And when you talk to Labour Party members about that, they just ignore it.
Well, what does that mean, set a legal budget?
Well, that's a good question. Because what it really means is continue with the status quo. The way that we put it, and as someone living in an area in Liverpool called Old Swan, we've been standing in the local elections and fighting austerity and cuts for the last 3 years. So we're called Old Swan Against the Cuts and Austerity. So, sorry, say your question again.
Well, you know, standing against the cuts, I mean, how do you stop the cuts? And Jeremy Corbyn, why would Jeremy Corbyn say keep the legal budget and not say we're going to get rid of the public-private partnerships, which are ending up privatizing and encouraging private capitalists to come in and take over public services?
Yeah. I think because the central question is, when you're dealing with socialism, you're either dealing with reformism and the change through Parliament, and thinking that that Parliament can bring in the changes, rather than emphasising a different sort of socialism that says what we win on the streets, we win in struggle, and through mass struggle. And I think these are the two divergences which are going on in this country. So what would we say about the local budget is we need a needs budget, and we need to fight for that. So that if you're under attack inside a Labour Council, fight. Because when it's gone, you're not going to get it back so easily. So the important thing is to fight. And so after Corbyn came into office as the leader, what we found was a tendency to mobilise to oppose Labour councils really fell down. We could organise up to 500 people outside Liverpool City Council. Afterwards, the next one that was called got 10 people.
Because it was like the Labour Party leadership now are good, and they're going to fight for us, so we don't have to mobilize against the Labour Party councillors who actually are implementing privatization in Britain.
Yeah. Some people think, oh, we should support Labour councillors who are voting against the cuts. Great. My question then is, where are they? Who are they? Please tell me. And there's deafening silence. I think a few years ago, about 4 said, oh, we're voting against the cuts. They were expelled. They just got rid of them. So,
is that purge still going on? What's happening with the purge in the Labour Party?
Well, I think in the Labour councils, the message has come through very strong and clear. If you start voting against the cuts, you're out. So people are just silent. And people who voted, some Labour councillors say, oh, I voted for Jeremy Corbyn, but they also vote for the cuts. So all this will get, if Jeremy Corbyn wins a general election, wherever that may be, the same thing will come into Parliament, because it will be a balance of the capitalist forces inside the Labour Party. And
the Labour Party is a bourgeois Labour Party. It's not a workers' party. What is the nature of the Labour Party in Britain?
I think the best definition still remains that it's a bourgeois workers' party, which of course most.
What does that mean?
Well, most famously characterized by Lenin, but what it means is that the leadership is tied to capitalism, absolutely. Is Jeremy Corbyn? Yes, he is. He is.
He wants to reform capitalism.
He wants to reform capitalism. And he wants to maintain all the links with many of the international institutions of capitalism. So he's made a statement going, we will be part of NATO. Well, one of the strongest war machines on the planet is NATO. How can a socialist be part of NATO?
And why does he say that if he calls himself a socialist?
Well, I think that's the great confusion that exists in this country. What is a socialist? Because there's a reforming socialist and a working class, militant, organizing, revolutionary type of socialism. In other words, Marxism. So, the great struggle, for example, that Rosa Luxemburg raised between reform or revolution, between reform and Marxism, between opportunism and Marxism, etc., is very, very much alive today, but not that many people are talking about it.
Now, the election of Corbyn, and some people believe the election of Sanders, you still have the same system, even if they get elected. It's a capitalist system in Britain.
Yes, no, absolutely.
What do you see happening if Corbyn was elected? Because the conditions that gave rise to Corbyn, anger about what capitalism is doing, are still going to continue to exist.
No, absolutely. And I think it's very clear the way Corbyn is going to go, because there are some things he does not say at all. Have a look at the programme. When he talks about nationalisation of British Rail, it's only when the franchises come to an end. So that could take 20 years to happen. And of course, many different governments in between. So, and then he said with PFIs, we will examine PFIs and perhaps nationalise.
So he's hedging on these private-public partnerships.
Yeah. So he talks a little bit about it, but there are some things he doesn't talk about at all. As far as I'm concerned, the people who run and control this country, the City of London, the banking system, etc., and the large multinationals, they should all be in public ownership, every single one. If you say, we want a socialist alternative to what exists, you have to go down that road. Even if you think it is really, really difficult, but it doesn't matter. You've got to say what is. So, but Corbyn does not say nationalise the banks. He does not say nationalise the multinationals. It's not in the programme. So when he comes to office, what's he going to do? Well, they will remain. So the heights of the capitalist economy, the power centres, will remain. They may bring in, we should have a little bit more regulation here, a little bit. But we know that capitalism can always find ways around regulation.
So what development would that lead in the working class? Because there are a lot of workers, young workers who I've interviewed who support Corbyn. They think that that's why they've joined the Labour Party, that Corbyn is going to change things. Yeah. And when he gets elected, do you think that there's going to be a disillusionment and frustration?
I believe so, because I think, for example, they will see it as a victory if Jeremy Corbyn gets elected. We've beaten the Tories. Okay, that's true. But I think inside that feeling amongst the youth is, we've pushed capitalism back. Well, that depends what they do, because they'll be hoping for some changes. Of course, Corbyn might nationalise one or two rail companies, take over 2 or 3 of the franchises. That he might do a little bit here, a little bit there. But, of course, as we saw just in the last few days, capitalism is extremely unstable. And
this is imperialism that's in crisis, U.S. imperialism. It's interesting that Trump was talking about the march, the healthcare march to support the NHS, saying that shows that the NHS is not working. Yeah. And you had the situation where the Tories were attacking Trump, saying the NHS is working. Is that a little shocking to you?
Well, with the Tories, nothing shocks me because they're such a lying bunch. They'll say anything to get.
I mean, they've been attacking themselves, the NHS, and now they're attacking Trump because he's criticized.
I think, there's a number of reasons for that. One of the old reasons is, we should hang on to some votes, to some support. The membership of the Tory party is hemorrhaging. oh, so let's say something to try and stop that.
We're not Trumpites.
No, we're not Trumpites, which of course they are, but they got to. But also because I'm not sure exactly what the situation is now, but Trump said he was going to come, and then he said, mate, if there's no opposition, stop the demonstrations on the streets. What are you going to do? Use the army to go on the street? Well, I mean, it's kind of unbelievable.
Well, one of the things about the march, and I interviewed people on the march, was it was demanding full funding for the NHS, that people were dying, that this basic system, which is for the people, the working class, is being destroyed. But it seemed that there was no call for mass mobilization to bring down the Tory government, which is implementing the cuts. I mean, there was no call for a general strike and using the power of the working class here to actually bring down this government.
I mean, this is an extremely important point, because if Jeremy Corbyn is this strong socialist Labour leader, if the Labour Party, as many people do think, is the party of the working class, then this leader has to say, let's end this Tory government now. I urge every single trade unionist to come out on strike. I urge the TUC to start mobilising and building the strikes. And only then can we really say the Tory government is weak. Yes, it's weak, but so what? Who's going to bring it down? Legally can stay in office for quite some time. It might self-explode, but they do have.
Well, some have argued here that they're not ready to take power.
Oh yeah, no. But are you for the working class or not? Which means you support every single strike, you call for more strikes, you call for the mobilisation in the neighbourhoods, and you try to build a movement of all the different communities and the trade unions and the working class to deal with the immediate question and the bigger questions. And for example, like in this strike, suddenly in many UCU branches, people are joining the union. So many people say, people are leaving the union. But when you start saying, right, 14 days of strike, people aren't going, oh, that's too much. No, people are going, right, let's get stuck in. So more people are joining.
So they want to fight back.
They want to fight back. And that's the real essence of what's happening in this country. The rank and file want to fight back. So we have to go back a little bit more to 2011, when the attack on pensions was taking place, public sector pensions. Over 2 million people came out on strike towards the end of November. And they were all saying, right, that was a good one day, great. Next week, when's the next one? So they asked that the next day, they asked that the next week, they asked that the next month, and then in the end they gave up asking. And the TUC eventually, 6 months later, called a demonstration. But what they should have done, and every single TUC union went along with this.
They're afraid. For example, a protest march around the NHS by itself doesn't really change anything. No. It lets off steam.
Exactly.
But it's not going to really confront the Tory government.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you were in the Madrid conference, that if you have a demonstration, then the idea is, right, tomorrow, go back to your factories, go back to your workplaces, etc., and let's create a bigger movement than the one we've got. Not, oh, that was a really good, nice, good, okay, you can all go back home now and carry on.
So Jeremy Corbyn sees his view of socialism coming to power electorally.
Yeah.
And this is going to be an electoral process.
Yeah.
Not a mass general strike to bring down the May government.
Absolutely. That is the most fundamental difference between those who think like I do and Jeremy Corbyn. It's all kind of smoothly, and it is not going to happen that way. But also, actually, to bring down the Tory government through strike action is the best way to defend a future Labour government. Because clearly the attacks on them, but the Tories could become so discredited, and history knows many of the examples of this, where even the Financial Times, like it said not too long ago, Corbyn could be an option. And so they want the structures maintained.
Well, better Corbyn than a socialist revolution, where their banks are seized and the working class. But the financial situation globally, that we just had a collapse of the stock market, temporary. But, I mean, the deregulation, the speculation, the financial capital speculation that's going on globally are likely to lead to economic collapse globally. What would the effect here be in Britain?
Well, I think it would be enormous. I think it may be pushed very quickly in those circumstances, certainly into a pre-revolutionary situation, because manufacturing has gone down by 10%. So manufacturing is declining, and the stock exchange and all the financial is such an important part. Now, in terms of a world crash, that can get wiped out. And so British capitalism could go into a very, very deep crisis. Compare it to German capitalism, which has a much greater manufacturing base. In that sense, is much more powerful, has much more trade with China and so on than Britain does. So Britain is the fifth largest imperialist power in the world, but I think it's on very shaky legs. So these international movements of capital and crisis can impact back here, because obviously they want to fund all kinds of things across the world. So if they're in crisis, it's going to feed back into London. And the huge problem they have is the falling rate of profit. You know, there's a lack of investment, has been for quite some time now. I think the same applies to the United States, or two different countries. But you know, there's many different points of crisis that capitalism are facing here. Above all, it's becoming senile. You know, the first capitalism in the world to emerge, when it was a great Britain, if you like.
Well, there used to be a great America.
Sure. So, yeah, and obviously that points to the fact of the type of organization we need to build in the working class. Not only has it to take to the streets to be very democratic, organized through mass assemblies and so on and so forth, but it has to be internationalist as well. Everything that it's fighting is part of, you know, the institutions of international capital. You know, from the banks to those who own the railways. You know, Deutsche Bahn and so on. And so there's a world system. So we have to establish relations, and very deep relations, with the working class in Europe and, you know, throughout the world. So I think this is something that's also missing from those with the reformist outlook. Of course, they may call themselves internationalists. They'll write a motion, maybe in support of a big strike somewhere in the world. But the real thing is to go and meet. Like you've come to Britain. So it's important for workers here to go to the United States, to go to Europe, and to meet and discuss how can we advance together.
Well, it seems like in the fight against privatization, outsourcing, this is an international struggle. You have U.S. capitalists forcing that on the world through the IMF and the World Bank. Yet there does not seem to be an international fight back against privatization and outsourcing by unions who are directly affected. In the United States, the teachers' union, the education unions, and public workers' unions. Is there a united front in Britain against privatization and outsourcing among the unions?
There are many, many written motions, but maybe they come up all the time now in the congresses of these unions. And there's a little fight here and there, but they don't really want to link it up together, because the union leaderships are so connected to the Labour Party. Unite and Unison are affiliated to the Labour Party, so their main message is also wait for a Labour government. So in fact, they even attack their own members when they start to fight. So the Durham teachers' assistants, mainly women, something like 1,500, and the Durham Labour Council said, right, you're going to have to take a wage cut. Of course, they tried to disguise that and so on, but they fought for a year and a half against them. They got no support from the Labour Party, and in the famous Durham Miners' Gala, which brings, you know, a lot of, maybe 100,000 people together, they had one of the biggest contingents, these women, teachers' assistants, and they marched into the field, and they were not allowed to speak from the platform.
Who prevented them from speaking from the platform?
Well, I would think it was the influence of Unison and the Labour Party and so on, because
Because this would be embarrassing to Corbyn and the Labour Party leadership.
they had a speaker from Unison, a woman who was the regional organiser, I think, if I'm correct in saying that. But certainly they had a speaker from Unison. But again, for us, I think some of us are really fed up of going to marches and listening to full-time officials give their version of events. What we want to hear are those workers who are on strike every single time.
Their voice directly.
Their voice directly. And we talked to them. Obviously, we were supporting them. And they told us that, Unison is like 1.3 million people. 1 million are women. But only a few sections of Unison supported the strike of the women.
In other words, this national union, it's similar in the United States, they faced a struggle to defend their basic rights, and their national union did not mobilize its weight, its power, for them to win that strike.
Yeah, and had they done so, they would have won. Because the feeling, we were on the Durham Miners Gala last year, and it was like, as they start marching down, everybody was like, wow, you're right, power to you and everything. So the support was there.
So this bureaucracy in the trade unions in Britain, and it's similar around the world, they don't want a mobilization of the working class. They don't want millions of workers marching.
Absolutely.
That's too dangerous?
That is far too dangerous, because you start to develop your own organisation. For example, the Durham Teachers' Assistants, they formed a strike committee because they couldn't get anywhere with Unison. And Unison started to accuse that you're splitting the union. No, they weren't splitting the union. They were going, we want to control our own strike. Do we support that? 100%, every single time. And if they call that an unofficial committee, so what? As far as we're concerned, whatever organisation the working class need for their struggle is what should happen. So it begins to make a connection with, after the Second World War, again, not so many people talk about this, the proliferation of unofficial committees in the docks, in the mines, and engineers, and so on and so forth, against a very hard union and labour bureaucracy that again said, no, we're bringing in the welfare state. No, they formed their own official committees, and they, like in the dock workers, of course, they built the Blue Union, the new union, in the 1950s, something like 10,000 dockers or something. And in Liverpool and Birkenhead, it was a very powerful development. But that is beginning to come back, obviously in new forms. Sometimes it's inside the TUC union, sometimes it's outside the TUC unions. But as far as we're concerned, the new unions and the rank and file of the TUC should unite. And
that would change the whole political dynamic of the situation in Britain.
Well, it would begin to do that. I think the ideas of how you do that and how to see this as an expression of real independence of the working class is beginning, but it's got to develop. That doesn't mean every attempt is going to succeed. But it's like the early days of the trade union. Sometimes they come up, a very powerful union would come up and then collapse again. So they go through experiences. But the very important thing is to get that experience of struggle. Because like here, these are university lecturers and support staff. They're not revolutionaries. And yet now you say 14 days of strike, wow, people like it. They want to come in and they want to fight. Why? Because their lives are going to be destroyed to some extent if this pension attack goes ahead. So now you come to a very interesting situation. It's not just, yeah, we need a 5% pay rise. Sure, people do. But, it's like not the end of the world if you get a 3%. You know what I mean? It's like, it's an important struggle. But the pension one is even more important because it's, of course, the whole social wage, the amount of money the university puts into pensions is like taking a very, very big wage cut. So, so this is happening in many different parts of the country. I think much more than most people realise.
So you're optimistic, really, about the rise of the working class and the developments of the class struggle here in Britain for the working class?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some workers could get caught up in the referendum campaign, going, "Oh, life is so terrible."
What is the referendum campaign?
Sorry, whether the UK should remain inside the European Union or not. So the referendum obviously predates the Brexit sort of development, and so the vote was very, very close. But the Brexit won, so that
This issue of Brexit and these corporate trade agreements, capitalist trade agreements, what about direct links between the workers in Britain and the workers in Europe with fighting the same multinationals? I mean, that can happen regardless of what agreements, trade agreements you have, can it?
It can, but very clearly the European TUCs wish to block an open and militant and democratic connection of workers.
So they don't really want the workers linked up directly, fighting the capitalists and the multinationals, regardless of the trade agreements.
I'll give you an example, very concrete example of how they do this. You know, there's a very, very important strike of the Spanish miners, and then they marched from Asturias to Madrid, and the population of Madrid mobilized from like 2 o'clock in the morning, saying, "We are the Spanish miners, welcome." So here, because of the support of the Spanish miners, you know, years ago, 1984-85, to the British miners' strike, so there was there's a big feeling. So spontaneous little groups of miner support started to emerge here. And of course, what you do, well, you raise the money, you tell people what's going on, and then it's very, very easy for British people to get to Spain. So you get on a plane and you go. Did that happen? Well, the TUC had negotiations with the CCOO, the union, the General Federation Union for the miners in Spain. And they said, no, we'll set up one miner support group. And there will be no others. There will be no others. So this was done with, you know, some who have a reputation of being good, like the Durham miners, but they kind of went along with it. So they set up a miner support group. And that was it. If you want to support the Spanish miners, send us some money.
So they didn't want any real direct links.
They didn't want direct links. They want, you know, the TUC actually doesn't want it to exist, or if it does exist, it wants to keep it under its control.
So this trade union bureaucracy really is an obstacle to linking up the workers of Europe.
I think the TUC is an enemy of all the ideas I've been talking about. They partly exist, or mainly exist, to put a stop to these kind of developments. And sometimes the working class will break through. And again, like that's why the importance, again, this Madrid, you know, it's a number of important unions. It's a small minority of the European working class and the world working class, but it's showing a way forward.
Now, the social democracy, which has dominated many countries for a long time, that's in crisis. And as you've said here in Britain, social democrats have actually instituted the cutbacks and the austerity. The collapse of social democracy, what is replacing it?
Well, well, of course, in Britain, one of the things we'd say about that is Jeremy Corbyn saved the Labour Party. Without him, it could easily have collapsed, like it has in other countries, in Greece and so on. So there's a beginning of a consciousness of the need for an alternative. But the question then is, what alternative? I think along the lines that I've said, you know, whatever form it takes. One of the phrases that is used is neo-reformism. So Syriza is a very important example to study because it went through many experiences, including government. But at its beginning, it had a very strong program to fight against capitalism on behalf of workers, of public ownership, etc., etc.
And it accepted.
Well, you could see the way that it was going because in a number of its congresses, it began to tone down some of the things. So when it came to the election, we'd say, well, if we were in Greece, we'd vote for Syriza, but we know there are already problems inside Syriza, and we wrote this. But it moved very, very quickly to accept the agenda of the European Union. So I think today Greece is no longer an independent country. Its budget is controlled from the Troika.
But isn't the European Union doing that to every country? I mean, basically, they take over the banks. I was in Greece. Yeah. It's run by the European Union. It's run by the German banks, Deutsche Bank and others. They're really running the show, as are the banks running Britain.
No, that's right. That's right. So, as the social democracy, who are part of all that process, collapse, then the points that you've just made need to be absolutely central in the thinking of those who are trying to build an alternative. So I think here is because we're talking about a European capital which is in deep crisis. We talked a lot about Britain and the UK and the weakness and the crisis. But that's the same thing inside the European Union. They don't really know how to handle the situation with the UK. They don't want the UK to leave. They know that it will weaken the European project. So they're trying to do everything they can to shore it up.
And do you think Trump is in favor of breaking up the European Union for the benefit of U.S. capitalism, U.S. imperialism?
One day he is, maybe the next day he isn't. But I think, in general, the UK have also been warned that the special relationship which people talk about with the United States, in other words, we tell you and you do, but that special relationship.
Well, apparently May was told, according to some reports, she better not accept the Silk Road with China or else, that was going to be the end.
Yeah, no, so become even more subservient. And of course, American capital wants entry into the European Union, and so it will. It is very likely to find other places to do that. And of course, the news is kind of slanted here because they go, oh, well, Frankfurt's no good for that because it's German and that's the language and it's not a international city, etc., etc. So you keep on reading this kind of stuff, but of course, capital can overcome those kind of.
There are no borders for capital.
No. So. I don't know. Some advice for the Tories was don't leave the European Union, I think, from the US establishment, because they'd have preferred them to stay in. But clearly, they're on their way out. So I don't see that this is an easy road for either the United States, Britain, or the European Union. I mean, there's without going into great details about that, but I think that it is a huge problem. I think the United States is in China, in any case, in a very, very big way, much bigger than the UK is. One question I would have is how do we make the links with all those unofficial struggles going on in China, some of which are very powerful, of course, and the importance of linking with the, unofficial, illegal unions is an extremely important question. But I think, everything is changing under this crisis. So, for example, we learned in Madrid that Pakistani workers are going into China, working in the factories. So if you have organized links with Pakistani workers, there's the possibilities of sort of opening up links in this kind of way.